Morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me? I think so. My name is Christina Kepi. I'm the director of the Center for Canadian American Studies. I'd like to welcome the students here in the class and also to our virtual audience. Hello. It's nice to have so many of you with us here today. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. Western Washington University's main campus is situated on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea Basin all throughout the San Juan Islands and the North Cascades watershed from time immemorial. We express our deepest respect and gratitude to our Indigenous neighbors for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. In acknowledgement of the first day of Black History Month, the Center for Canadian American Studies and Western Washington University's Alumni Association are excited to welcome you to today's webinar titled Roots, and Reckonings on Blackness and Belonging in North America. Today's featured speaker is Professor Deborah Thompson. Professor Thompson is an associate professor of political science and the Canadian Research Chair in Racial Inequality and Democratic Societies at McGill University in Montreal. She is a leading scholar of the comparative politics of race, with teaching and research interests that focus on the relationships among race, the state, and inequality in Canada and other democratic societies. She is the author of the award-winning book, The Schematic State: Race, Transnationalism, and the Politics of the Census of 2016, and The Long Road Home on Blackness and Belonging in North America from 2022, very recent. This book, The Long Road Home, was one of Indigo and CBC's top 100 books of 2022, and a finalist for the Hillary Weston Writers Trust Prize for Nonfiction. In today's webinar, Professor Thompson will take us through an intimate exploration of the roots, R-O-O-T-S, or racines in French, of Black identities in North America, and the roots, R-O-U-T-E-S, route in French, taken by those who have crisscrossed the world's longest undefended border in search of freedom and belonging. This lecture will journey back and forth across the Canada and US border from coast to coast, combining memoir and analysis to highlight the tensions, contradictions, translations, and complications that anchor our understandings of race. Across time and space, Professor Thompson asks, where is home for those of African descent? And is belonging within the confines of the nation state either possible or desirable? So we're very excited to have Professor Thompson with us here today, not only as a guest speaker in our Canadian American Relations course here, but also as our second speaker of the Center's exciting 6-part speaker series that we're calling Why Canada Matters. So this is number 2 of 6. We have 4 more coming up, another one in a couple of weeks. This speaker series is brought to you by the generous support of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, Department of History, and in partnership with the Western Alumni Office. So just one more minute of housekeeping before we can dive in. For you, the virtual audience, some of you have already submitted questions with your registration. Thank you very much for those. If you have questions during the Q&A, we ask that you use the Q&A feature on Zoom, and should be on the bottom middle of your screen. And so that way we can receive any questions that you have during the presentation. And so at the end, we'll have about 15 minutes for questioning, and we'll get to as many as we can that really are the most appropriate for both virtual and in-class audiences. And I will be taking questions from the audience here in the classroom first. And I have a microphone that I can walk around. So those of you who are joining us virtually, we also recommend that you use the speaker view as part of Zoom. And I think that is it. So let's get started. I'd like everyone to give a warm welcome to Professor Deborah Thompson.
Hi, everyone. Okay, let me try to share my screen and we will see if it works. How can you see? Is it all good? Yeah. Okay, great. Amazing. So hi, salut tout le monde. Thank you so much to Janine and Christina for having me. I'm really pleased to see you all, well, kind of virtually at least. I am coming to you from Montreal, which is the traditional territory of the Ganakahake people. I'm quite grateful for the opportunity to live and work here in Montreal. And as you'll see from my presentation, I think that we have all need to have a commitment to Indigenous struggles, especially those of us for whom solidarity with other racialized people is necessary in the fight for justice. Okay, so with that being said, let me try to begin at the beginning. So once upon a time, a few mistakes ago, I was living in a faraway land called Oregon. It is not that far for those of you who are living in Washington right now, but it's very far from Montreal. And perhaps if you've been there, you know that Oregon is just this beautiful, breathtakingly beautiful place that's also uniquely unforgiving. If you cross the state from east to west, it's like you're traversing these invisible thresholds that separate alien worlds. And in many ways, there are ideological divisions in the state that seem to mimic those discordant environments. So it was January 2020, back before any of us had heard about anything called COVID. And at the time, like many Americans, I was appalled at the way that the Trump administration had stretched the norms of democratic rule. And like many Black Americans, I was unsurprised by the emboldened white supremacy of Trump supporters. And at the time, in January 2020, I was certain that Trump would win a second term in office. I can talk about why in the Q&A if you're interested, but I was convinced he was going to win again, as were many of my colleagues in political science. And by that point, in January of 2020, I had already decided to leave the US, where I had lived for over a decade, to come back to Canada, when someone from the University of Oregon's Museum of Cultural and Natural History reached out. The museum had this monthly pub talk that it used as a fundraiser. It featured faculty from the university who were willing to talk about their research to a broad audience. And the person who reached out asked if I would be interested in presenting my research. And I told the program coordinator that I didn't have any new research at the time because I had had 2 children and like no parental leave because of America. But I was moving back to Canada and I had a lot of feelings about it. So could I present a talk on my feelings about moving back to Canada? And she said, sure, of course. So the title of my presentation for that talk was Return Some Probably Incoherent Thoughts About Race, Democracy, and Going Home Again. And that talk became this article, which was published in the Globe and Mail, which is Canada's national newspaper, on June 6, 2020, just as the kinetic uprisings that were sparked by the murder of George Floyd spread like wildfire across the continent. And that article became the basis for this book, which is what I'm going to talk about today. Many drafts later, because writing is a messy process and you learn as you write, especially about all the things you thought you knew, but you now know better. And sometimes, like Neil Gaiman's character Dream of the Endless once said, the price of getting what you want is getting what once you wanted. So that book and the article in that first presentation all begin in the same way. It's with words that my father said to me in those early days of 2020, as I was lamenting the state of the world and the Trump presidency in particular. He said, you know, Deborah, your daughter was the first Thompson born in America since Cornelius Thompson escaped slavery. It's been over 150 years, and some days I think we came back too soon. And I could not get his words out of my head. They just struck me as being so astute. So some backstory. My dad was born and spent his childhood in Shrewsbury, Ontario. It is a tiny, tiny town about 50 miles east of Detroit on the shores of Lake Erie. It and some other neighboring towns like Buxton and Dresden were the last stops on the Underground Railroad. So in 1850, the US Congress passes the Fugitive Slave Act. It's part of a series of compromises that are made between the northern free states and the southern enslaving states. The Fugitive Slave Act requires officials to arrest people who are suspected of being runaway slaves based on little or no evidence, and it penalized officials who did not comply. Anyone who was found aiding a runaway slave by providing food or shelter was liable to 6 months in prison and a $1,000 fine. Monetary awards were offered to anyone who captured a fugitive slave, and those who were suspected of being fugitive slaves could not defend themselves against the accusations, and they couldn't testify on their own behalf. And so the result of this legislation was the legalization of a national program of mass kidnapping of free Blacks across the United States. But the Fugitive Slave Act didn't extend to Canada. And so it was to Canada that thousands fled, including my grandfather's grandfather, Cornelius Thompson. So most of the people who escaped to Canada actually went back to the US at the end of the Civil War to find the loved ones that they left behind or who were stolen from them. But generations of those who are descended from the Black American refugees from slavery still live in southwestern Ontario, including my dad's family. Because the communities were rural and segregated, my kin have the most wonderful way of speaking. My dad says things like, he pronounces it theater instead of theater, and he pronounces the WH in white. He talks in the same kind of rhythmic metaphors and rhymes that characterize barbershop talk in African-American culture. He says things like, you know, Deborah, those politicians got nothing but a nodding acquaintance with the truth. But he also has a Canadian accent, and it appears plainly in words like a boat and sorry. So Dad doesn't know where Cornelius escaped from. He thought he heard someone talking about Virginia or Alabama once, but he is skeptical. Deborah, he says, you're looking for ghosts. You're looking for people. You're looking for evidence left behind by people who were trying to hide and whose lives depended on how well and for how long they could do it. So many of our stories are ghost stories. How could they not be? African descended people in the Americas are connected by the horrors of the Middle Passage. That is the point during the route of the transatlantic slave trade when Africans were violently kidnapped from their traditional territories, commodified as objects, forcibly transported to the New World, and sold as property. And so the Atlantic Ocean, the goddess Yamaya's domain, also holds a place in our collective memory. There's blood in the water. It is the fathoms of the dead. When I decided to move back to the US a decade ago, I thought the ghosts of my ancestors would welcome me home. I felt like I was returning to the land of my ancestors' birth, the place where they sweated and toiled and were tortured and resisted and fought and wept as their children were stolen and sold, and were traumatized as they were raped for profit and murdered for sport, the country where they died, the places they still haunt. They escaped and I returned to lay claim to the humanity that they were refused. I felt like I was going home. And of course, I was wrong, but maybe not quite in the way that you might think. So what I want to share with you today is some of the invisible, maybe even ghostly matters that that emerge in this story of coming back both too soon and too late, and the construction of those moments and the places that work to define our identities. I want to tell you some of the story of what it was like to have lived in the US, which is the land of my ancestors, a country that both was and was not mine, but to be doubly unwanted as both an immigrant and a Black person, and there by choice and protected by incredible class privilege, but then to leave to return to this country, which I also love, even as I think most forms of nationalism are highly problematic. I want to acknowledge the unrepentant structural racism of American society while not negating the subversive, insidious racism of Canada. I want to relay my bewilderment and my awe at Black people's love for America, their pride in their country, their dedication to making it better, even as it has more often than not refused to love us back. But more than anything, I want to share what it means to be in a place to have ancestral ties to a place, to be haunted by the ghosts who are tethered to the land and water, the soil and the swamp, and to be not of that place. These are questions that I asked of myself and my audience during that first presentation back in January of 2020, just as I ask of myself and perhaps of you now, in the hope that we can collectively try to think through what it means to lay claim to a country, to believe in freedom dreams, to seek to belong, to fight for change, even if that change means we must abolish everything and start again. Okay, so let's begin. Americans often think of their country as exceptional. It is one of the world's oldest democracies. It's the birthplace of revolutionary freedom. It's the only remaining superpower. It's the last line of defense in a world that is threatened by dictators and demagogues. Most famously articulated by the French diplomat Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America, the concept of American exceptionalism suggests that the tenacity of American democratic ideals is unusual, extraordinary, or somehow unparalleled. There's something dramatic, or it could just be dramatically individualistic, about the primacy of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It always seemed to me to be so much more exciting, so much more daring than Canada's motto, which is peace, order, and good governance. But the doctrine of American exceptionalism requires a willful ignorance about how American democracy worked for those who were excluded from that original 18th century formulation of we the people. The self-evident truth of the liberal ideal is that we are all created equal, and it was scarred into the Declaration of Independence at the same time that nearly 20% of the population lived in bondage. From the vantage point of African Americans who reside in what the great Black sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois called the Black life world, the United States isn't exceptionally free or equal. American racism is, in fact, all the more tragic, more cunning, and more ruinous precisely because it exists alongside, but in direct contradiction with the idealism of the American creed, the pervasiveness of the American dream, and the homogenizing power of American national identity. And for those of us like me, who often observe American history in the making from abroad, the United States is only exceptional in terms of how utterly, how unforgivingly, how uncompromisingly racist it is. This idea of American racial exceptionalism is powerful here in Canada. American racism is understood as real and morally repulsive. And so in comparative terms, Canadian racism is either presumed to not exist, or if it does exist, it is perceived to be less harmful, less entrenched, and less traumatic than the racism of America. Now, there's a couple of reasons why Canadians tend to think this way, but the most relevant, I think, is that America and its foundational ideas, beliefs, narratives, obsessions, and psychoses have influenced the formation of Canadian national identity. Throughout our history, we, at least in Anglophone Canada, have struggled to formulate our own identity. It's hard to share a border, language, pop culture, and media with the world's only superpower. So for Canadians, the US is kind of like the mean girl in high school. She is essentially our very own Regina George. We hate her and we love her. And we think she's terrible, but sometimes she's not terrible to us, but she's frequently terrible to other people. But really, why won't she just pay attention to us? It hurts our feelings that she doesn't think we're cool. And so because there are a lot of cultural similarities between Canada and the US, being Canadian is defined, at least in part, by being not American. And this has ramifications for how we understand ourselves in racial terms. The logic goes something like this. Racism exists in the United States. Canada is not America, and so there is no racism in Canada. Comparison is routinely, frequently, and faithfully used in the service of Canadian deniability. It's our national pastime. an obsession that works to hide and enshrine the persistent racial inequities that define nearly every socioeconomic indicator in Canadian society. And yet the cognitive dissonance required to be righteously indignant about anti-Black racism in America, but defensive when the perpetrators are the us and not the them, is itself a peculiarly Canadian form of racism. This denial is aided and abetted by the way that Canadian multiculturalism has become a powerful part of our national ethos. No matter how multicultural we claim to be, however, there's one question that non-white people here get asked on the regular. Where are you from? No, where are you really from? If your presence has never been questioned in this country, it might be hard to hear the presumption in its presence, in its premise, the insinuation. Where are you really from? Because I can see you're not one of us. Where are you really from? Because you don't seem to fit in here. Where are you really from? Because I will stop you on the street and demand that you answer my question, because I am white and you are not. And deep down, I believe that you owe me your time, your respect, your patience, and your attention. Where are you really from? Because my curiosity is much more important than your safety or your comfort. Where are you really from? Because how long you've been here will tell me something about your place in this country. Where are you really from? Because you can't possibly be from here. For years, Black Canadian scholars have explored the absented presence of Blackness in Canada. The absented part describes the ways that Black people in Canada are assumed not to exist, or if we exist, to be recent arrivals to what has always been a white country. Catherine McKittrick writes that Blackness in Canada is always unexpected. It's always surprising. Blackness is surprising, she writes, because it should not be here, was not here before, was always there, here, is only momentarily here, was always over there, beyond Canada, for example. This means then that Black people in Canada are also presumed surprises because they are here, because they are not here and here simultaneously. So if we read things this way, the question, where are you really from, is an attempt to address the shock and the astonishment of seeing Black people in a place where we are not supposed to be. But Blackness in Canada is not just absent, it is absented. To be absented rather than just absent implicates the involvement of political processes that bring conditions into being. Our invisibility in national mythologies is neither a coincidence nor a mistake, but rather a purposeful crafting of the Canadian nation that renders Black people invisible. The presence part of absented presence implicates the ways that narratives of Canadian identity depend on the existence of Black Canada, even as they erase it. So the idea of Canada as the promised land, the destination for fugitive slaves who followed the North Star, a safe haven from the tyranny of American racism, a contemporary multicultural paradise. These are fundamental, foundational parables of the Canadian imagination, and they depend on the historical presence of an allegorical Black Canada, but just not too many Black people, of course, and certainly not angry Black people or radical Black people or loud Black people or ungrateful Black people or Black people who remember the razing of Africville and Halifax and Hogan's Alley in Vancouver, or Black people who point out the many ways that Canada tolerates Blackness only begrudgingly. This is part of the reason why a sense of real belonging for me was always kind of elusive in Canada. So the kind of belonging I wanted in the country of my birth, I instead sought in the country that enslaved my kin. Now, many immigrants experience a kind of culture shock when they arrive to their new country. It's a different climate, maybe a different language, different norms and customs. Obviously, this wasn't a problem for me when I moved from Canada to the US, except I underestimated the power of the narcissism of minor differences. So this is a Freudian theory that communities with adjoining territories and close relationships are especially likely to engage in feuds and mutual ridicule, in part because they are hypersensitive to the minute differences that actually differentiate them. So there are some differences between Canada and the US that everyone knows about, right? Like ketchup chips exist in Canada. We use Celsius instead of Fahrenheit. Fahrenheit makes no sense. You should stop using it. The way that every Canadian had said to an American friend, did you know that Ryan Reynolds is actually Canadian? Or that was filmed in Vancouver, actually. But it turned out that a lot about what I knew about America came straight out of pop culture. And so when I began living in the US and really became integrated into American society, I was surprised to find out a few things. One, cheerleaders are real. Who knew? Secondly, if you grew up as I did, kind of like coming of age in the 90s and the early aughts, you might think that New York was just for white people, but it turns out that there are people of color who live in New York too, and they're just not represented in pop culture. Portlandia is surprisingly accurate. I lived in the US for 10 years. I lived in Boston, the birthplace of the American Revolution. I lived in southeastern Ohio in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. I lived in Chicago, the great Black metropolis, and finally in Oregon, the Western frontier. I met amazing people. I taught amazing students, and I had a great time. It was actually incredible. But there are also parts of being a Canadian in America that I could never quite wrap my head around. This is a bill these are two separate bills for the birth of my children. And just so we're clear, the amount that I ended up owing hospitals and anesthesiologists for the birth of my children was much, much more than what I have circled here. But I didn't know what a copay was before I moved to the US. I didn't know what a deductible could possibly mean in the context of healthcare. I got used to asking about whether or not there would be guns in a household before I let my daughter go to a birthday party. But when she started having active shooter drills in her preschool, that was when I knew we couldn't stay. Americans really do believe in the American dream. They believe that this society is fundamentally a meritocracy. And if you work hard, you can be anything. But they also implicitly believe the opposite is true. If you are poor, if you are homeless, if you are sick, if you are destitute, that means you just must not have worked hard enough. But one of the most consequential differences between Canada and the US is the nature and the manifestation of structural racism. We often think about racism as people who are racist. They behave in racist ways, slurs that are shouted on the street. And that happens both in the US and in Canada, don't get me wrong. But racism is not just a function of individual attitudes, and so it cannot be eradicated by changing hearts and minds. Racism is the social, legal, political, and economic distinctions that mark and maintain unequal entry and access points to privacy, protection, prosperity, personhood, and privacy, property, protection, prosperity, and personhood. Racism has shaped the contours of every major social, political, and economic institution in the United States. Every single one. From banking and real estate to the location of highways and grocery stores, from the funding of K-12 education, the origins of the Second Amendment, and the lack of anything that comes close to universal health care, racism has touched every facet of American society in ways that I didn't understand until I got there. But there's another side to this too. When I was doing a presentation like this in Canada, and after it finished, an older couple came up to me and said, "Don't worry, we didn't think you were Black until you mentioned it." and they meant it as a compliment. And it was so Canadian of them. There is, I think, a value in the exploration of Blackness, belonging, and the politics of race in Canada and the US, not just in comparison, but rather in relation to one another. Ideas and inspiration, people and profits, goods and grievances have crossed the border for centuries. Black freedom dreams as well have never been bound by national borders. And so while others, no shade, but some of them compare racism in the US to these obvious circumstances of legal apartheid like South Africa or Nazi Germany, the insistence in Canada that racism happened somewhere else or happened a long time ago requires a kind of national ignorance, what the poet Dion Brand calls a stupefying innocence that itself is worthy of careful examination. Extreme cases have a lot to tell us, but so do unsuspecting ones, and Canadian particularities make for interesting politics. So Black communities in Canada are both very old, predating Confederation by more than a century, and very new, growing exponentially in the mid to late 1990s. The population is small at just 3.5% of the national population, but quite significant in cities like Montreal, Toronto, Halifax, and Ottawa. We are the diaspora of the diaspora, so to speak. Both old and new Black communities are the products of global collusions and imperial collisions of colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. But we in Canada have neither the level of political or cultural recognition as African Americans do in the United States, nor the magnitude of the millions that comprise the African descended population of the Caribbean or South America. We also have a unique kind of racial consciousness, which is the result of multiple formulations of Blackness in Canada that are crisscrossed with nationality, religion, ethnicity, generational status, language, class, and more, but are also shaped by the amalgamations, frictions, and translations that intersect with the shifting contours of Canadian politics and life. Organizing and creating solidarity within Black communities here in Canada is challenging, but also full of the potential that comes with recognizing authentically contradictory Black experiences. Blackness in Canada also exists within the crucible of Canadian exceptionalism. That is, Canada the exceptional, Canada the clearly not racist, Canada the good, Canada the white savior, Canada the successful multicultural experiment. The dismissiveness here of the realities of racism is part of the appeal, because if we are the global exception to racial rule, then we have no need to examine our exceptionally Canadian racial rules. It's a distraction, obviously, because Canadian racism is shaped not just by a global history that gives it a familiar force and feeling, but also by those specificities that make it Canadian born and bred, just like me. So it's an open question about how Canadian racism is shaped by Canadian democracy, Canadian political structures, Canadian liberalism, Canadian whiteness, Canadian politeness, Canadian public policy, Canadian political parties, Canadian political culture, Canadian popular culture, Canadian urban centers, Canadian regionalism, Canadian ruralism, Canadian media, Canadian peacekeeping, Canadian war making, Canadian bilingualism, Canadian settler colonialism, and the Canadian national inferiority complex. Moreover, structural racism in Canada doesn't necessarily manifest in the same way as it does in the United States. Structural racism here is highly malleable. It is purposeful exclusion and predatory inclusion. It is invisibility and hypervisibility. It is operationalized by the differential effects of universal laws and policies, the informalities and discretion that are built into systems of power, hidden entry points, overly emphasized exit ramps, and normalized patterns of behavior that are excused away because this is just the way things have always been done here. Systemic racism is state action that deliberately limits movement and the accumulation of wealth and access to opportunities. And it is also when governments choose not to act and instead let racist systems remain undisturbed. It is selective interest, sustained indifference, and messages of personal choice that naturalize racial inequality as a consequence of individual failings. It is government protection and benefits that are hard to access or which are withdrawn without reason. And it is also the co-optation of radical demands in order to make them more palatable, more marketable, and more profitable to corporations. The truth is, there's a lot that we don't know about the nuances of Canadian anti-Blackness. It is hard to research that which is so consistently jettisoned into the realm of the unthinkable. I came back to Canada in the summer of 2020, and it was a particular moment in time. Some called it a racial reckoning, hearkened by death, substantiated through struggle and haunted by the conceptual space between what was imaginable and what was possible. We didn't know at the time what had come crashing into the public sphere, full of chaos and passion, fury and rapture, and later, sadly, predictably, dilution and co-optation. Even now, we are years removed from the uprisings of 2020, and there isn't a coherent narrative that can explain why it was the world stopped to protest, to grieve, to rage, to rebel, to mourn together. I started writing this book during that moment when protests in Minneapolis and LA, New York and Toronto, Montreal and London seemed like they were a seismic disruption with the potential to catalyze finally an acknowledgement that white supremacy was born and bred in the global sphere, an understanding that racism can manifest in the realm of ideas and can move across borders as easily as the wind. An appreciation that historical context and local circumstances still matter, but they nevertheless are inflected with lessons and lesions from elsewhere. A resurrection of the disruptive and fracturing, compounding and conflicting potential of diasporic solidarity across borders. Reckoning might not be the right word for all that has happened between then and now. The idea of a reckoning, not unlike reconciliation, is about honored promises, debts repaid, and a balance restored. To reckon can also be used to express dreams and expectations, just as readily as a reckoning also faces the past again and again, like the way that a return involves circling back to the beginning of a journey. What is clear, I think, is that the moment we were once in has now passed. The moment that we are in now is much less clearly defined, much more indeterminate. It's a moment when, as David Scott writes, old horizons have collapsed or evaporated and new ones have not yet taken shape. We're in a time of speculation and flux, vulnerability and risk, incoherence and yet still possibility. It's a politics without guarantees, as the cultural theorist Stuart Hall once put it. And so take heed, we might not like what emerges from the other side of this moment. Racial progress has always been shadowed by disproportionate backlash. And we're very clearly in the middle of that backlash now. It manifests as the attack on critical race theory, the death threats sent to Black journalists, the use of woke as a disparaging slur, and the insistence here in Canada that white professors have the academic freedom to use the N-word in their classrooms. It is the dilution that turned radical demands to rethink what we mean by justice into nothing more than a 1-hour DEI workshop. It is as much the benign neglect of the state as it is the collective shrug of Canadians and Americans everywhere about the predetermined failure or the purposeful sabotage of so many of the initiatives we had hoped would change our workplaces, our education system, our social moorings, and our access to substantive democratic belonging. But nothing would have happened had Black people and our allies not taken to the streets. As the great orator and abolitionist Frederick Douglass once said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. And so at what is the beginning, not the middle, and not the end of this most recent iteration of backlash against racial progress, the very least we can do is remember and try to make sense of all that was and all that still could be. Truth be known, as I write in the book, using my experiences as an entry point into a broader inquiry about race, Blackness, and belonging makes me deeply, deeply uncomfortable. It was not my idea to have this much of me in this book. That was a compromise between myself and my press. But the story in The Long Road Home really isn't about racism at the end of the day. We can't only write about racism, about domination, of despair and loss. Instead, we write about life. We write about impossible life because we live in the impossible. And we can struggle towards impossible things with other impossible people. No one is illegal. No one is illegal on stolen land, land back. In Black studies, where I live most of the days, storytelling is tradition, repetition is sacred, and writing is the process of turning bewilderment into awe. Black studies as vocation isn't just interdisciplinary, but is instead antidisciplinary and undisciplinary, in that we seek the knowledge through which we will achieve racial justice in this world, or we will remake it so that those who follow can. The truest thing about travel and movement, as anyone who's ever gone anywhere knows, is how people change as they move. Our identities, our understandings of home and belonging are not fixed. They're not once and for all. And so the idea of return is the stuff of fairy tales, going back to a place where we once were, but no longer are, and yet desire to be. It's a futility of the highest order. You can't ever go home again. Not because home changes, but because you do. That's all I have. Thank you. It's weird to do a presentation and not be able to see people, especially when you're making jokes. I'm going to assume you all laughed.
We all did.
Okay, good.
I can tell you. Thank you so much, there, Dr. Thompson. This was wonderful. We have some time for questions, and we do have some that have come in over Zoom, like I mentioned, but we're here in a classroom full of students, so I'm going to throw it out to everyone here. If we have any questions. Okay, I'm walking to the back of the room. We've got Liesl here and a microphone.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi. Yeah, I can hear you.
Hi. I've actually met you once before. I lived in Eugene and we lived in the same dorm while you were there.
Yes, I loved living in Eugene, and I loved living in Eugene. It was the
I
best.
also left. Yeah. But I was curious, as someone with a varied identity, is there a physical place that you feel belonging, or do you feel that more so with connections through other people like family or friends?
Yeah, that's a good question. So part of the book, what I tried to do in the book, I don't know how successfully I did it, was to think about the like the power of movement, you know, like the ways in which like we think about movement as you know, getting from point A to point B, but so what I was trying to do in the book is kind of think about the way in which movement itself is a space, you know, like it's a transitory space. But I was trying to conceptualize like who we are and what we do when we're in transit. And kind of like, and talk about that in relation to some of the literature on diaspora and transnationalism, which thinks about movement in really interesting ways. It thinks about time and space in interesting ways. So I was trying to kind of get at that. As for like a personal answer about like, where do I feel like I belong? Like, I don't know. I don't know. Like I said, when I was younger, really did believe, in ideas of nationalism. You know, I really did believe that like there was such a thing as national belonging. And I don't anymore, you know, so much. And, you know, I think that the people of African descent have had to make our homes wherever we are. That's kind of like that's the legacy of the Middle Passage. It's the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade and institutions of slavery in this country and in the United States. And so as somebody who's moved around quite a bit, that's what I've had to do. And now, like, look, like I'm in my 40s, right? I have children. And so, like, if you remember my children who lived in the dorm with us, you know, like my home is where they are. So.
Thank you. Any more questions from the class here? Going once, going twice. I'll move to some online questions here. Okay, we have one that came in and it starts off by saying, William Julius Wilson's book titled The Bridge Over the Racial Divide, Rising Inequality in Coalition Politics, attempts to draw the reader's focus more on the interests we hold in common. Is convincing people of the tensions and contradictions of race distracting us away from the essential aspects of multicultural efforts to transform both our neighborhoods and the global economy?
Wow, that's a big question. So there's two questions in there that I can try to address. One is about Wilson's work. You know, so Wilson is most famously known for his work, The Declining Significance of Race, which was published in 1979. He's a Harvard sociologist, I believe, in which he argues in that work and other works, he doesn't argue that race doesn't matter, right? He argues that it's race as it intersects with class, and in his newer work, as it intersects with where people live in particular, that matters the most. Right. And so, you know, so people misread his, I'm not saying this questioner misread his work, but people do misread his work a lot. And, you know, in which like they look at a title like The Declining Significance of Race and conclude like, oh, that means race doesn't matter. And that's not necessarily what he's arguing at all. Like one of the interesting things in his work is like, okay, like let's look at the different circumstances that face Black working class folks who live in urban centers and Black middle class folks who have broken into the suburbs, right? Like broken into like these all white neighborhoods in the suburbs. So the interesting thing though, like where this questioner is going is quite interesting, because if you look at the origins of the concept of race, it emerges from fear of class struggle. And what I mean by that is in the US, the first like laws we have that invoke like legislated differences between people identified as white and people who were identified by the state as Black or of African descent, they always came on the heels of potential rebellions. Right, and this isn't my argument. This is the argument of W.E.B. Du Bois, right? Who in like his opus, he wrote a ton of books, but in his opus Black Reconstruction, talks about the way that like whiteness emerges, particularly at moments when political elites fear a cross-racial, class-based solidarity of working class, like and poor whites at the time, poor whites, enslaved Africans and free Blacks across the United States. So whenever political elites feared an uprising, right, where poor white people and poor and enslaved Black people saw, in fact, that they had a lot in common, that's when they invoked race to create what Du Bois called like the wages of whiteness, right? Because you make white people believe in whiteness. You make them believe that they, in fact, are inherently better, inherently superior to Black people. And they suddenly don't see the way that we're all exploited by the capitalist system, right? That's the history of race in the United States, right? And so in some ways, like, yeah, race has historically acted like as a distracting concept from like the kind of like exploitation we all face in a capitalist system. On the other hand, right, we're like 200, 300 years removed from those origins. And what we have now are an economic system in which to be, for example, white and middle class and to be Black and middle class are two very, very different experiences. right? And this is borne out in all the data we have about like the precarity of the Black middle class. In fact, economists recently have begun to argue that if you look at wealth, which is what you own, so like what you own minus what you owe, if you use wealth as an indicator of social like SES status instead of income, there is no Black middle class. Right, like there is no Black middle class because the Black middle class is so precariously defined, right? One bout of cancer and people slip, like they lose their middle class status, Black people do. Whereas white people, when faced with crisis, often have savings or family or like other sources of income to rely on. So that's kind of the first part of that question. The second part of the question about multiculturalism, I wrote a piece with Keith Banting that was published last year, in which like one of our arguments, like the piece is called The Puzzling Persistence of Racial Inequality in Canada. And one of our arguments is like, you would think in Canada, which is like the birthplace of multiculturalism, you would think that we would be a country that does not have racial economic inequality, right? We have like single payer healthcare, we have multiculturalism, we have a race neutral immigration policy, we have a welfare state that actually works kind of better than it does in the US at least, right? You would think that these social safety like supports would work to at least lighten the effects of like endemic racial economic inequality. And yet in this country, what we see is persistent racial inequality that's been in place since John Porter wrote and was like the first one to like discover it in 1965, right? And in some cases, for some groups, and Black people are among them, the racial economic inequality persists over generations. Right. And so like the thing about multiculturalism in this country is that it does nothing, right? Like if you actually look at multiculturalism policies in Canada, the budgets are tiny, right? Like it's not doing any, like there are very few anti-discrimination provisions that are included in our multiculturalism policy. And like the one piece of legislation that we have that's meant to like be a positive action to rectify endemic racial economic inequality, I'm talking about the Employment Equity Act, which is Canada's version of affirmative action. It doesn't work. And it doesn't work because there's no enforcement mechanisms. It only applies to a tiny percentage of the Canadian workforce, right? Like the Employment Equity Act doesn't even work in the federal government, which is facing at least 3 lawsuits now from Black employees because of the systemic racism that they have faced within the ranks of the federal government. So that would be my answer to those two, that one big but two partitioned question.
Thank you so much for that. That was a wonderful response and actually touched on some of the other questions that have come in.
Cool.
So yeah, that was great. Any other questions from the class here?
Come on, students. I know you have thoughts.
Yeah, anything. It's almost midterm time, or it is midterm time here. So there's some thought. Well, we have one. I'm coming to the back.
Hello, my name is Tristan. Is there anything specific that needs to happen, or is it still completely out of your mind to move back to the US?
I don't know, offer me a job.
Go Dogs.
I can be bought. I don't know. I might move back to the US. So before I left the US, I actually got American citizenship. And there are a couple reasons why I did. The most pertinent of which, and I write about this in the book, is that my children are American. My daughter was born in Chicago when I lived there, and my son was born in Eugene, Oregon. And I felt like because they were American, I need to be able to go where they go. And like, it's gonna sound dramatic. I write about this in the book. It sounds dramatic, but like my fear was based in like a kind of dystopian Children of Men type world. And I felt like I need to be put in the same pen as them, right? I need to be able to go where my children go. That was like very, very important to me. As a parent, literally your only job is to protect your children and love them. Like that's all you have to do. And I felt like if something happens, I need the citizenship to be able to go where they go. And that's like, it sounds dramatic, but like I used to teach a course when I worked at Ohio called political science fiction, because I love science fiction. I'm a super science fiction nerd. It was before everyone else started loving science fiction. Like I read The Handmaid's Tale in like the 90s, like before you all were alive. The thing about dystopian science fiction is most of it is based on things that have already happened to Black people. Right. So like, for example, if you've read The Handmaid's Tale, if you watched the series, I actually haven't watched it. But like the idea that you would use women as breeders, slavery. Yeah, that's like what happened. That's what happened to Black women in slavery. Right. And so kind of the fear of the fear of like this intergenerational trauma of not being able to protect my children, it runs like real deep. And so I got American citizenship. And this is all to say that like the idea of ending up back there one day, like that's a possibility, that's something that could happen. The other kind of more practical side of this is, I know we have a bunch of Q&A, so let me see if I can answer this quickly. I went on the job market I got my PhD in 2010. I went on the job market in 2009. Perhaps you might recall that President Barack Obama was elected in 2008, and I could not get a job in Canada. Like I moved to the US because people were like, one, why are you studying racism in Canada? There's no such thing. And two, Barack Obama is president of the United States. There's no racism anymore. Right. And so like I could not get a job. And the basic fact of like the way that the academic job market is structured in Canada is that like there are more universities in, I think, Ohio than there are in Canada. Like it's a huge country geographically and a tiny country in terms of demographics, right? There's 35 million people in Canada. There's more people in California. And I'm facing like an uphill battle here. Like I think that attitudes have changed a little bit. Like I am like a Canada research chair and there are many people who recognize the validity of my work. And there's a lot of people who think there's no racism in Canada at all. Like whenever I publish anything I publish in the Globe and Mail a lot, like op-eds or whatever. And like the hate mail I get more hate mail in Canada than I do when I worked in the US. And I used to get like death threats in the US and I get way more here. So this is all to say that like, I might go back to the US, one day, who knows? I'm never going to be able to retire because my retirement savings are disasters. So I'm going to work until I die. So who knows? I have like 40 years left.
Well, thank you so much for that. I think we'll leave it there because we know that you have to jump in the car and get on your way to Ottawa for a film premiere that you worked on. Yes. So again, on behalf of the Center for Canadian American Studies, Western Alumni Office, and our sponsors who were so generous with this speaker series, thank you so much. We appreciate your time and your effort. And thank you to Dr. Mazen Heslop and her students for allowing us to come into your class today. We greatly appreciate it. For those of you who joined us virtually, there will be the recording sent out here soon, and it will be provided to the students here as well. So thank you again so much, Dr. Thompson. We wish you the best and good luck on the roads. I hope you beat the traffic.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening, everyone.